Step behind the gilded doors of the Sultan's palace, into a world where elegance and opulence concealed a life of intense pressure. Here, within the secretive walls of the harem, women navigated a complex maze of expectation, obedience, and unspoken rules. Their graceful movements through marbled corridors and their laughter in lush gardens often masked a deep-seated fear and a profound sense of longing. In private moments, the curl of fragrant smoke offered a brief escape from the constant scrutiny and the invisible yet powerful social hierarchies that governed their every move. In this place, beauty and influence were double-edged swords, both a weapon and a shield. Every glance, every whisper, every gesture was a strategic play. Yet, amidst all this grandeur and control, these women carved out small, hidden freedoms. These silent acts of defiance were their way of preserving their dignity, their selfhood, and their enduring spirit. Smoke drifted where silence was expected, not from rebellion, not from a fire, but from something far more dangerous inside the Sultan's palace's escape. Behind walls meant to protect honor and power, women learned quiet ways to leave without moving, to travel without footsteps, to disappear without a single door ever opening. The harem was never just a place of confinement. It was a world of observation, patience, strategy, and invisible survival. From the outside, the Ottoman palace appeared timeless, ordered, and absolute. Marble courtyards reflected authority. Guards stood motionless. Protocol ruled every single breath. But inside, beyond the ceremonial halls and public splendor, life slowed down into something else entirely. Time behaved differently in the harem. Days were not measured by grand events, but by repetition. Waiting became an occupation. Silence became a language. The word harem has long been misunderstood. Popular imagination turned it into a fantasy or a scandal, flattening its complexity into a spectacle. In reality, it was a complex institution, highly structured, hierarchical, and intensely political. It housed mothers, sisters, servants, attendants, administrators, and educators. It was a space where women lived under intense regulation, but also where they formed communities, rivalries, alliances, and private rituals that shaped imperial life in ways that are rarely acknowledged. For many women, entry into the palace did not begin with choice. Circumstances like family debt, political exchange, war, or recruitment systems brought them inside. Once they arrived, the outside world faded away remarkably quickly. Their names were changed. New languages were learned. Their entire identity was reshaped to fit the palace order. Individual history mattered far less than the ability to adapt. Education was central to this new life. Women learned etiquette, music, embroidery, poetry, theology, and the art of conversation. This wasn't because leisure was valued, but because refinement was a form of currency. Knowledge was survival. The ability to speak carefully, to read moods, to remain composed under pressure. These were tools as vital as loyalty. Every gesture was observed. Every mistake was remembered. But beneath this strict discipline lived something quieter. Boredom, longing, curiosity, grief. The palace provided safety from the poverty and chaos of the outside world, but it came at the cost of autonomy. Even the highest privilege came with heavy constraints. Movement was restricted. Communication was monitored. The future was always uncertain. For many of these women, the greatest danger was not cruelty, but invisibility. This is where the idea of escape began, not through gates, but through inner worlds. Smoking, in this context, was not an indulgence. It was a pause. It was control over your own breath, in a place where almost nothing else was under your control. Tobacco, incense, scented mixtures, these were moments stolen back from regulation. The act itself mattered less than what it created. A sense of stillness, separation, a mental distance from the constant scrutiny. Some women used smoke as a ritual, others as a simple habit. Some used it for shared communion, whispering secrets in the haze, while others used it as a solitary refuge. Inhaling meant slowing down time. Exhaling meant release. It was a small but profound way to mark out private space in a life lived under constant supervision. Beyond smoke, there were stories. Women told each other tales from distant regions, some real, some invented. They described cities they had never seen but longed to imagine. They memorized poetry and subtly altered its meanings to fit their own lives. Through storytelling, they escaped their confinement by reconstructing reality within the walls of their minds. Friendships formed quietly, but so did rivalries. The harem was not a unified sisterhood, it was stratified. Status shifted constantly. The Sultan's favor could elevate a woman to unimaginable heights or destroy her completely. Women learned to read power not as something announced, but as something implied. The tone of a voice, the timing of a glance, the focus of attention, all of it mattered. And yet, despite the intense competition, a form of solidarity often emerged. Shared constraints created a unique kind of understanding. Older women mentored younger ones, not always kindly, but with hard-earned knowledge. They taught them how to endure without breaking, how to remain visible without becoming vulnerable. The palace itself reinforced this tension. Lavish, beautiful rooms concealed strict, unyielding schedules. Breathtaking beauty masked constant surveillance. Comfort coexisted with control. For every embroidered cushion, there was a rule governing its placement. For every quiet corner, there was a reason it was rarely left unoccupied. Religion provided structure and, for some, solace. Daily prayer offered routine, a time for reflection, and a sanctioned form of inward escape. But even faith was shaped by palace life, practiced communally, and observed carefully. Personal belief remained personal only in the privacy of one's thoughts. What history often misses is that escape does not always look like departure. For the women of the harem, escape meant maintaining a sense of self, in a place where that self was constantly being reshaped by others. It meant cultivating inner resistance without ever showing open defiance. It meant finding freedom in moments, not in destinations. Letters were rare but powerful tools. Some women wrote messages they knew they could never send, hiding them in personal belongings, or simply memorizing them instead. Others composed songs that were meant to be forgotten as soon as they were heard, a fleeting expression of a hidden feeling. Memory itself became a hiding place. The harem also produced influence in indirect, subtle ways. These women shaped the education of future rulers. They advised, they suggested, they reframed issues. Their power was not official, but it was persistent and real. Decisions whispered in private often echoed much louder than orders shouted in public. Still, for many, the cost was heavy. Loneliness lingered. Youth passed by slowly, measured in seasons, not milestones. Dreams were adjusted downward. The palace offered security, but never certainty. Few women knew what awaited them beyond their current rank. Hope became a cautious, guarded thing. And so, the smoke returned again, and again, not as an addiction, but as an interruption. A moment where the rules of the world loosened, just enough to breathe differently. In those quiet moments, women remembered that time belonged to them, if only for an instant. The Sultan's palace was not only a symbol of immense power, it was also a container for human lives lived in a careful, precarious balance between obedience and inner freedom. The women inside were not passive figures waiting to be noticed. They were observers, survivors, and quiet strategists. Their escapes were small, deliberate, and often completely invisible to the outside world. And yet, these small acts of self-preservation accumulated. They built resilience. They preserved identity. They ensured that even within the most controlled spaces imaginable, something wild and uncontrollable remained. This is where the real story begins, not with scandal, not with fantasy, but with a single breath, with smoke rising where silence was expected, with women finding ways to remain themselves in a world that was determined to define them. Long before the sun touched the city, life inside the palace had already begun. It wasn't heralded by sunlight, but by routine, a rhythm set generations ago. Here, sound traveled differently. The soft shuffle of footsteps, the whisper of silk, the low murmur of instructions, nothing was by chance. Every movement was part of a grand, intricate design meant to manage hundreds of lives under one roof. Hierarchy was the invisible architect of this world. Your status decided where you slept, who you spoke to, and how your day was spent. Rank wasn't announced, it was seen. It was in the quality of your clothes, your closeness to the most important chambers, the number of times you were summoned. Getting ahead wasn't a straight line, it was a dance of timing, temperament, and the unpredictable whims of favor that were the lifeblood of the palace. New arrivals learned a crucial lesson fast. Attention was both a ladder and a cliff. To be noticed could lift you to new heights. To be noticed for the wrong reason could shatter your future in an instant. So, the smart ones learned the art of balance. They were present, but not prominent. Capable, but never a threat. Silence became a language, an observation, an instinct. People often imagine the harem as a secluded cage, but it was the empire's nerve center. Information was its currency, flowing in constantly. News of court decisions, foreign arrivals, and military campaigns, all filtered through the network of servants, attendants, and guards. The women listened. They knew that knowledge, even fragments of it, was power. It created leverage in a world where you had little else. Daily life was a tapestry of duties. Some women were keepers of rooms, managers of priceless textiles, or preparers of elaborate ceremonies. Others were educators, teaching languages, court etiquette, or the delicate arts of music. A select few handled administration, keeping meticulous records and managing schedules. These were not simple tasks. They demanded intelligence and absolute trust. A single mistake was never forgotten. Time moved in its own way here slowly, but never empty. True idleness was a luxury few could afford. Even in moments of rest, hands were kept busy with intricate embroidery, and minds stayed sharp, absorbing every word of a conversation. Leisure itself was structured, a tool to occupy without ever liberating. And yet, within these rigid lines, humanity found a way. Friendships blossomed in the shared quiet of a corridor, born from years of exchanged confidences. Women bonded over a common homeland, a shared language, or simply being the same age. These relationships were a lifeline, an emotional anchor in a swirling sea. But they were never simple. Trust was a cautious investment, and secrets were weighed carefully before being shared. Competition was rarely a loud affair. It was a subtle, silent game of positioning. Who spoke first? Who deferred? Who was invited to join a conversation? The palace rewarded those who could read the unwritten rules. If you couldn't pick up on the social cues, you would find yourself slowly, quietly, excluded. Your presence would just fade, with no explanation given. The older women were the living libraries of this world. Having weathered the storms of youth, they became the guardians of institutional memory. They knew which actions earned favor and which sparked resentment. Their advice was always practical, stripped of sentiment. Survival had molded them into realists. They taught the younger women a vital lesson. Endurance was more valuable than brilliance. Consistency trumped passion. In this place, emotional control wasn't a weakness. It was your strongest armor. The palace didn't punish ambition itself, but it was unforgiving of miscalculation. In such a controlled environment, small, personal rituals gained immense meaning. Sharing tea, the careful art of grooming, a quiet moment by an open window. These were acts of reclaiming a piece of yourself, of finding normalcy. Privacy was a rare treasure, but it existed. You learned to find it in certain corners, at certain hours. You memorized the patterns of movement around you, using the palace's own predictability to carve out moments of solitude. The world outside was an echo, an abstraction. Seasons were felt in the changing temperature, not seen in the landscape. Festivals were heard as distant sounds drifting over the high walls. News from family, if it came at all, was filtered and delayed. For many, the past became a dream, reshaped by memory until it was barely recognizable. This profound distance changed a person. Women adapted so completely to palace life that imagining another existence felt like trying to remember a foreign language. The idea of freedom was unsettling, unfamiliar. The palace, for all its restrictions, offered a kind of certainty. Outside, there was only the unknown, but longing never truly died. It wasn't always for escape, but for meaning. Many found purpose within their given roles. To achieve excellence in music, in language, or in administration became a quiet act of defiance, a way to assert oneself. It was proof of your capability, even if the world never saw it. Life in the harem wasn't a state of constant high-stakes drama. It was one of sustained alertness. You navigated your days with care. Mistakes weren't explosive. They were cumulative. A careless word, a misplaced glance, an alliance that soured each was a small weight that could slowly, silently, alter your path. But even here, humor survived. Laughter, often quiet and shared in a single glance, was a release valve. It was a reminder that you were more than just a function in a grand machine. Religion also provided an anchor. Daily prayers structured the day, creating moments where the rigid hierarchy seemed to soften. In those quiet moments of reflection, there was a kind of equality, not social but spiritual. It was a grounding that no rank could take away. As days bled into months, and months into years, the way you measured your life changed. Success wasn't marked by grand milestones. It was stability. It was remaining in favor, maintaining your health, and avoiding conflict. These were the victories. In this context, escape wasn't a single act of running away. It was an ongoing, internal process. It was the ability to guard your inner world when your outer world was controlled, to think for yourself, even when your actions were dictated, to remember who you were beyond the role you were assigned. The palace didn't crush everyone. Some thrived, finding comfort in the predictable rhythm. Others carried a quiet, hidden sorrow. But most existed somewhere in the middle, resilient, observant, and enduring. These women were not passive figures. They were active participants in a living, breathing system, shaping it with every small choice they made. Their influence might not be in the history books, but it was felt in the relationships they built, the guidance they offered, and the continuity they preserved. The harem functioned because of them. Its order rested on their discipline. This was the reality of daily life inside the Sultan's palace. It wasn't a fairy tale, and it wasn't just a prison. It was a complex world of negotiated existence. And within that world, generations of women learned that survival didn't mean you had to disappear. Inside the opulent halls of the Sultan's palace, education was never an accident. It was a deliberate, controlled, and deeply political act. Knowledge wasn't handed out freely. It was distributed with a clear purpose. The women of the harem weren't taught to question authority, but to understand it. And over time, this understanding became its own form of quiet, potent power. From their earliest days within the palace walls, young women were trained to observe long before they ever dared to speak. Their lessons began with language not just for communication, but to shape the very way they thought. Ottoman Turkish was the foundation, of course, but Persian poetry was used to refine their emotional expression, while Arabic connected them to the world of faith and law. As the empire began to engage more with Europe, foreign languages entered the curriculum. This wasn't about idle curiosity. It was a matter of state necessity. A woman who could understand words, could understand intention. Translation was never a neutral act. It required sharp judgment, sensitivity, and perfect timing. Those who mastered this delicate art gained influence not by issuing commands, but through interpretation. A phrase softened, a meaning clarified, a tone subtly adjusted. These small choices could redirect entire conversations, shifting the course of events in ways no one could trace back to them. Music was taught with the same level of seriousness. Every note, every melody, carried social meaning. Performances weren't about raw individual expression. They were about crafting an atmosphere. A particular song could soothe rising tensions at court, while another could signal deep respect for a visiting dignitary. The women learned to sense the mood of a room before making a sound, to value restraint over a dramatic flourish. Music became a language they could speak without risk, a way to communicate in plain sight. Poetry served a similar, vital function. It created a safe space for complex emotions to exist without being directly stated. Love, sorrow, ambition, regret, all of these could be expressed safely through the elegant cage of verse. A poem recited at just the right moment could communicate what could never be said openly. Women memorized hundreds, sometimes thousands, of poems, quietly altering a line here or there to mirror the realities of their own lives. But their education extended far beyond formal lessons. Daily life itself was an endless series of instructions. How one walked through a corridor, how one responded to sudden, intense attention from a superior, how one accepted a correction. These were lessons learned through constant, painstaking repetition. Mistakes were rarely punished loudly or openly. Instead, opportunities would simply diminish. Access to important people would narrow. One's very presence would begin to fade into the background. Older, experienced women played a critical role in this intricate system. They were living archives of palace life. Their authority came not from official rank, but from decades of lived experience. They knew which skills helped one endure, and which ones attracted dangerous attention. Their guidance was practical, often blunt, shaped by the harsh realities of survival rather than lofty idealism. This mentorship happened quietly, woven into the fabric of everyday tasks. Advice was offered in fragments, not grand speeches, whispered while embroidering or preparing tea. Observe more, speak later, do not rush what comes slowly. These simple phrases carried more weight than any formal instruction ever could. They were the keys to longevity. Education also taught, above all else, restraint. Emotional control was absolutely essential for survival. The palace valued calm, predictability, and unshakable composure. Women learned to manage bitter disappointment without a single tear, and to temper overwhelming excitement without any outward display. This discipline wasn't enforced through cruelty, but through the immense pressure of expectation. To lose control was to lose all credibility. The presence of children within the palace added another profound dimension to this learning. The women responsible for their care understood the immense importance of setting an example. They taught behavior just as much as they taught information. A child's curiosity was encouraged, but their discipline was strictly reinforced. They knew that the entire future of the empire was passing through their hands, shaped by these quiet daily lessons. This responsibility created a form of influence that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. The values they instilled in a young prince or princess could shape the course of leadership for generations to come. Books, while limited in number, were treasured possessions. Reading was an act of inward expansion, a private journey. Stories of distant lands, morales parables, and histories of past rulers all provided crucial perspective. They reminded the women that the palace, with all its rigid rules, was just one system among many, not the entirety of existence. This awareness nurtured a kind of internal escape. Learning allowed them to inhabit multiple worlds in their minds, even as their bodies remained confined. Knowledge created a vital distance between their circumstances and their sense of self. It was in these moments of quiet reflection while reading, or in thoughtful conversation, that you might see a woman smoking. It wasn't an act of excess, but a deliberate pause, a controlled breath, a way of slowing down time. The smoke marked those precious moments where the palace's grip seemed to loosen, if only for a little while. Now, this education did not promise freedom. It offered something else: navigation. The women learned how to exist within strict limits, without allowing themselves to disappear. They learned how to shape outcomes indirectly, how to endure without surrendering their inner spirit. The very stability of the harem, and by extension the empire, depended on this collective internal intelligence. Without these educated, adaptable women, the institution would have collapsed under the weight of its own rigidity. Their skills allowed it to maintain continuity through political shifts, changes in leadership, and immense external pressures. Yet, this education also carried a heavy cost. Awareness sharpens longing. The more you know, the more you understand what is possible, and the more you see what is permanently out of reach. Managing this painful awareness required an emotional discipline, just as rigorous as any intellectual skill. As a result, ambition evolved. Few women dreamed of a physical escape. It was simply unrealistic. Instead, ambition turned inward. It focused on mastering one's role, on achieving consistency, on earning quiet respect. Success was measured by longevity, not by visibility. The palace rewarded those who could endure with grace, and their education taught them precisely how to do that, without erasing their true selves. It was a way of preserving their identity beneath a mask of uniformity. Seen from the outside, the harem might have appeared silent, a place of quiet submission, but inside, it was a world constantly thinking, analyzing, and adapting. The women's influence didn't announce itself with a trumpet blast. It accumulated, slowly, drop by drop. In this way, learning became both a shield and a key. It protected them from unnecessary exposure while unlocking pathways of influence that were completely invisible to the uneducated. Education was not liberation, but it was survival refined into a high art, a strategy. And so, within those marble walls, and behind guarded corridors, minds remained active, alert, and quietly resistant to erasure. The Sultan's palace did not extinguish thought, it concentrated it. Relationships inside the palace were never simple. Every bond carried weight, every attachment, a risk. In a world where proximity could either elevate or destroy, the women of the court learned to approach closeness with a profound sense of caution. Affection existed, but it was always measured. Loyalty was valued, but it was never absolute. For those living within these gilded walls, survival depended on maintaining a delicate balance. Friendship was both a refuge and a vulnerability. Shared experience created a unique understanding that was impossible to find anywhere else. Think of two women who entered the palace together, clinging to each other through the disorienting early years. They would learn the rules side by side, correcting each other's mistakes and softening disappointments through quiet companionship. These bonds provided a vital emotional grounding in a place designed to regulate and control every feeling. Yet, even friendship required constant awareness. Alliances could shift without warning as the currents of favor changed. A woman who was elevated today might be distant tomorrow, not by choice, but by the rigid demands of circumstance. To remain too closely tied to another's rise or fall was a dangerous game. It could pull you down unexpectedly. So, the women learned to care without dependence, to support without entanglement. Trust developed slowly, cautiously. Secrets were shared in fragments, never all at once. Words were chosen with immense care, because silence often carried more meaning than speech. The palace rewarded discretion, and those who practiced it survived the longest. The older, more experienced women often advised restraint and attachment. They had seen, time and again, how closeness could be weaponized, how confidences could be repeated, how simple emotions could be twisted and interpreted as ambition or manipulation. Their guidance wasn't born from cynicism, but from the practical wisdom of years of observation. Loyalty within the harem was a complex tapestry. It did not function like loyalty outside its walls. Allegiance shifted according to hierarchy, duty, and above all, self-preservation. Women were expected to support the established order above any individual. Personal bonds existed, of course, but they could never replace institutional expectations. This didn't mean affection was absent. On the contrary, care expressed itself through subtle actions rather than grand declarations. A garment adjusted discreetly, a warning whispered at just the right moment, assistance offered without ever being asked. These small gestures carried immense significance precisely because they were subtle and unspoken. Rivalry, too, was rarely dramatic. It unfolded quietly, through positioning and omission rather than open confrontation. A woman might suddenly find herself excluded from a conversation, reassigned to less visible duties, or simply overlooked. Such shifts often occurred without any explanation. In this environment, emotional restraint was essential. Public displays of jealousy, anger, or even deep grief disrupted the harmony of the court and drew unwanted attention. The women learned to contain their emotions, not to suppress them entirely, but to channel them inward. This discipline was not a form of cruelty, it was adaptation. The palace was not a forgiving place for excess. Even moments of loss were managed with careful precision. When a friend was reassigned, dismissed, or simply disappeared from daily life, any acknowledgement was brief and formal. Mourning occurred privately, if at all. Public sadness invited scrutiny, and the relentless rhythm of the palace allowed little space for visible grief. And yet, humanity always persisted. Laughter would emerge unexpectedly in quiet corners. Shared glances across a crowded room conveyed volumes of understanding. Humor, dry and witty, softened the ever-present tension. These moments didn't challenge the system, but they preserved the inner life, the spark of self, within each woman. Relationships with authority figures added another layer of complexity. Respect was mandatory, but proximity was a double-edged sword. The attention of someone powerful could feel affirming, but it always carried unspoken expectations. The women learned to respond appropriately, to be gracious without encouraging dependency or inviting resentment. This required a high degree of emotional intelligence, refined through years of experience. For some, attachment became a form of identity. They derived their purpose from service, their pride from reliability. Others resisted this, maintaining a fierce sense of self that was separate from their role in the palace. Both approaches carried their own risks. Detachment could be mistaken for disloyalty, while deep investment could invite profound vulnerability. Religion often offered a structured space where emotional expression was permitted. Shared prayer could create a temporary sense of equality, a moment where the rigid hierarchy softened. In these quiet, collective moments, women found a shared grounding, a reminder of a continuity that existed beyond the transient life of the court. In these quiet interludes, a woman might take a slow, deliberate breath, a small ritual of reflection, a reminder of her own internal boundaries. It was a moment to acknowledge an emotion privately before folding it back into a mask of composure. The palace demanded constancy. Relationships were expected to endure without intensity, to exist without causing disruption. This expectation shaped how women loved, trusted, and remembered. Over time, emotional restraint became second nature, an instinct. New arrivals learned quickly from those around them, absorbing the unspoken rules: care carefully, attach lightly, and endure quietly. These were not signs of coldness, but survival strategies developed under immense pressure. Despite everything, these bonds left their marks. Years later, women would remember the voices, the gestures, the shared routines. Memory preserved what could not be displayed openly. Relationships lived on internally, long after the outward connection had ended. The harem did not erase feeling. It refined it into something less visible, more contained. The women became experts at managing their own emotional landscapes without altering the external order. It was this skill, this quiet strength, that sustained them through years of uncertainty. The relationships inside the palace were not weaker because they were restrained. They were different, shaped by context, necessity, and a hyper-awareness of the world around them. They existed in a constant, delicate tension with power, adapting and shifting every single day. In this environment, attachment was neither forbidden nor free. It was negotiated, moment by moment, adjusted as circumstances changed. The women learned to remain open without becoming exposed, to stay connected without becoming dependent. These relationships, so quiet and complex, formed the true emotional infrastructure of palace life. They carried the institution through years of repetition and change. Without them, the palace would have been an efficient but empty machine. Instead, it remained profoundly human-controlled, yes, but alive with the subtle, intricate dance of connection. And within that controlled world, women continued to find ways to care without breaking, to remember without lingering, and to remain themselves without demanding a space that could never be given. Power inside the palace was never announced loudly. It moved quietly, settling into routines, gestures, and patterns of access. Women learned early that authority was not always held by those with the highest rank, but by those who understood timing, proximity, and restraint. Visibility was not power. Control of visibility was favor. Was the most unpredictable force within the harem. It could arrive without warning and disappear just as suddenly. Women spoke of it carefully, rarely naming it directly. To acknowledge favor openly was to invite scrutiny and jealousy. To deny it entirely was to appear ungrateful or unaware. The safest response was a delicate balance, acceptance without expectation. Those who gained attention learned quickly how fragile it was. Favor brought comfort, opportunity, and influence, but it also intensified observation. Every action became subject to interpretation. Neutral behavior could be recast as ambition. Silence could be read as calculation. The margin for error narrowed to a razor's edge. Some women withdrew deliberately when attention grew too intense. They softened their presence, deferred opportunities, avoided moments that might place them at the center of notice. This retreat was not failure. It was a conscious strategy. Survival often required knowing when not to advance, when to blend back into the background. Others navigated favor differently. They accepted it fully, understanding its risks, and used its brief warmth to secure stability for themselves and those around them. Their success depended on ironclad emotional discipline and acute awareness. A single misstep, a moment of misplaced pride, could reverse years of careful positioning. The palace rewarded predictability above all else. Those who behaved consistently earned trust. Sudden changes in demeanor were noticed and questioned. Women learned to maintain steady patterns, even when their inner worlds were in turmoil. This consistency reassured authority and reduced suspicion. Power also flowed through service. Women who managed logistics, education, or communication wielded influence quietly. They shaped daily operations, controlled access to information, and ensured continuity. Their authority was functional rather than ceremonial, but it endured long after favor had faded for others. Favor could elevate a woman temporarily, but competence sustained her. Those who relied solely on attention often fell when it shifted. Those who built reliability into their roles adapted more easily to change. The emotional cost of favor was significant. Attention created expectation, both spoken and unspoken. Women were expected to embody calm, gratitude, and discretion simultaneously. Any deviation could be interpreted as ingratitude or ambition. The pressure to perform stability became a constant, suffocating weight. Smoke often appeared in moments of withdrawal. It accompanied quiet reflection after intense scrutiny, a way to slow the breath and recenter an identity that was constantly being defined by others. It marked the return from public attention to the private self. Power relationships extended beyond individual women. Groups formed around shared responsibility or proximity. These clusters influenced the atmosphere and decision-making within the palace walls. Membership was fluid, but awareness of these dynamics was essential. To ignore them was to risk complete isolation. Women observed carefully how others rose and fell. They learned from absence as much as from presence. When someone disappeared from routine, questions went unasked, but lessons were absorbed. In the palace, silence was profoundly instructive. The palace did not encourage overt ambition, but it recognized capability. Women learned to present competence without assertion. Initiative was acceptable only when framed as duty. Innovation was tolerated when it appeared as a subtle refinement rather than a disruptive change. Favor often intersected with timing. A woman's readiness mattered as much as the opportunity itself. Those who advanced too early exposed themselves to unnecessary risk. Those who waited too long faded into obscurity. Reading this timing required immense patience and humility. Age altered relationships with power. Younger women navigated the turbulent waters of uncertainty and attention. Older women relied on accumulated trust and experience. Their influence was less visible, but far more stable. They served as anchors in a constantly shifting environment. Their wisdom a quiet guide for those who knew to listen. The loss of favor was rarely a dramatic event. It unfolded through reduced summons, reassigned duties, and quieter days. Women recognized these signs quickly. Their response mattered. Acceptance preserved dignity. Resistance only accelerated the decline. The palace valued composure above all else. Women who endured loss without a public display of emotion often retained respect. Those who reacted visibly attracted further scrutiny. Emotional control remained their strongest protection. Despite this, ambition did not disappear. It transformed. Women aspired not to dominance, but to equilibrium. Stability became the ultimate success. Simply remaining within the system without harm became a quiet victory. Power inside the harem was relational. It existed between people, not above them. Understanding this allowed women to navigate its complexity without direct confrontation. Influence traveled through trust, habit, and reliability. The Sultan's palace was not static. Leadership changed, priorities shifted, and external pressures intruded. Women adapted continuously, recalibrating their behavior to align with new expectations. Those who survived longest were those who learned quickly without appearing to change. Favor, once gained, was never owned. It was borrowed. Women treated it accordingly, using it cautiously and preparing for its inevitable departure. This realism protected them from devastation when circumstances shifted. In this environment, escape often took the form of detachment. Women learned to invest without surrendering their entire being. They participated fully while guarding their inner autonomy. This delicate balance preserved their resilience. Power did not belong to those who sought it openly. It belonged to those who endured quietly, understood the structure, and navigated uncertainty with restraint. The palace rewarded patience more than brilliance, and subtlety more than force. Women who mastered these qualities shaped outcomes without leaving visible traces. Their influence was written into continuity rather than into the official record. And so, within the Sultan's palace, power moved without sound. Favor flickered without warning, and women learned to stand steadily within both, breathing carefully, choosing their moments wisely, and surviving not through dominance, but through a deep and quiet understanding. Inside the palace, time moved, but it felt different. The measure wasn't in birthdays, but in the subtle shifts of attention, expectation, and energy. A change in a daily routine, a slightly longer wait between summons, a new, less central role. These were the whispers that a new phase of life was beginning. To grow older in the harem wasn't seen as a failure, it was a transition. Those who survived long enough knew that just being there, year after year, was an achievement in itself. It was less glamorous, sure, but often much more lasting. Women found they were watched less closely, questioned less often, and with that came a quiet sense of relief. Expectations narrowed. The physical space they occupied, once so scarce and competitive, slowly expanded. But this shift required a profound adjustment. An identity built on being seen, on being favored, had to be completely reshaped. Women who had defined their worth by their proximity to power had to learn to let go, and to do so without bitterness. Those who adapted found a new, stable footing. Those who resisted, who clung to a past that was slipping away, found only struggle. Older women held a unique position. They were no longer the center of attention, but they were absolutely essential. Their experience made them reliable. They knew the palace's rhythms, its secrets, its unwritten rules, better than anyone. Their very presence was a reassurance of continuity. The authorities trusted them because they were predictable, steady. Their responsibilities changed. Many took on supervisory roles, overseeing daily routines, managing supplies, and mentoring the younger women who were just starting their journey. These tasks lacked the sparkle of courtly intrigue, but they held real influence. Through them, the older women quietly shaped the behavior of the entire community, reinforcing the palace's institutional memory. The advice they offered was always practical, forged in the fires of survival. The palace didn't reward fighting against the current of time. It rewarded adaptation. Of course, this phase came with loss. Grief was a private affair, managed internally. Women learned to carry their memories without showing the weight. Health, too, became a more present concern. Weakness was managed carefully, and women took a quiet pride in maintaining their composure, even as their endurance was tested. In these quieter years, the outside world felt increasingly distant, like a story told in a foreign language. News arrived filtered and abstract. Seasons passed without them ever stepping outside the walls. For many, the dream of a life beyond the palace faded. Instead, their focus narrowed to maintaining balance within the world they knew, and this wasn't always a sad thing. For some, it brought a profound sense of peace. The certainty of their routine replaced the ache of longing. Mastery over their environment replaced ambition. The palace, in truth, relied on these older women. Their steadiness was the invisible foundation that stabilized daily life. When crises arose, a change in leadership, a threat from the outside, it was they who maintained the calm. Their influence was subtle, but it was fundamental. The younger women watched this transition, and they learned. They saw that survival wasn't just about holding on to attention. In the end, their purpose had simply changed shape, maintaining continuity, guiding others, preserving the quiet order of things. These became their meaningful contributions. The palace didn't build statues to them, but it depended on them. Without the quiet, tireless labor of its aging women, the entire institution would have fractured. And in this final stage of life, as the urgency of youth faded and reflection deepened, they found a different kind of escape, not from the palace, but from fear itself. They became the living memory of a world that rarely wrote their names down, their influence enduring in the very fabric of the place they called home. In the grand palaces of history, power wasn't always a spectacle. It wasn't shouted from rooftops or declared in grand pronouncements. Instead, it was a quiet current, a subtle pattern you could only see if you knew where to look. It was in the way a room would fall silent when a certain person entered, or whose opinion, offered softly, could shift the course of an entire debate. By the time the women of the harem reached a certain age, they had mastered this silent language of influence. They understood that real power didn't need a stage. It just needed perfect timing. The older, more experienced women became masters of observation. They learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is say nothing at all. They would watch conversations unfold, tracking the ebb and flow of ego and argument, waiting for that one precise moment, the moment when a single, well-placed sentence could redirect a decision, steer a conversation, or plant an idea that would later bloom as if it were someone else's. This wasn't just intuition. It was a skill honed over decades. Years of watching, listening, and remembering. They knew the personalities of every attendant, the secret habits of high-ranking officials, the subtle shifts in mood that always preceded a major change. This quietly gathered knowledge wasn't just trivia, it was leverage. It was the currency of true influence. Of course, this kind of power was rarely, if ever, acknowledged openly. The official story, the one the palace projected to the world, was that authority flowed neatly from the top down, through clear, unshakable hierarchies. But the reality was far more complex. Power moved sideways, flowing through hidden networks of relationships, trust, and shared history. And it was the aging women of the harem who were the undisputed gatekeepers of this hidden network. They were the ones consulted in hushed tones, the ones whose wisdom was sought discreetly, and the ones who were almost never given public credit. Their influence was a foundational, yet invisible, pillar of palace life. Day to day, the palace operated like a perfectly calibrated clock. Meals, ceremonies, maintenance, and protocol, everything followed a rhythm that had been refined over generations. And who were the guardians of this intricate dance? The older women. While younger residents performed the duties, the elders ensured the traditions. The very soul of the routine remained intact. They were the living memory of the institution. In this later stage of life, discipline took on a gentler form. Gone were the days of harsh commands. Correction was now conveyed with a quiet glance, a meaningful pause, or a soft-spoken suggestion that carried more weight than any formal reprimand. The younger women learned a crucial lesson very quickly. Disappointing one of these respected elders carried consequences far more lasting than any official punishment. It was a loss of favor, a subtle exclusion, a lesson in respect that they would never forget. Over time, emotional restraint became second nature. Experience was a harsh but effective teacher, and it taught them that public displays of emotion only invited unwanted scrutiny and vulnerability. Feelings were a private currency, expressed selectively, and only in the trusted company of close companions. It was in these quiet, shared spaces that true bonds were forged. These relationships, built slowly over years of shared experience, provided a deep sense of stability that the fleeting passions and uncertainties of youth could never offer. As evening fell, the entire atmosphere of the palace would shift. After the final prayers, a softness would descend. The bustling sounds of the day would dim, and the long corridors would echo with a quiet peace. This was a time for reflection. Small groups of women would gather, their conversations unhurried, their memories shared without the need for embellishment. Their stories weren't grand tales. They were precise, shaped and polished by the passage of time. Memory, for them, was a complex companion. It was both a comfort and a burden. Recalling the days of their youth could bring a wave of sweet nostalgia, but also a profound sense of relief that those turbulent times were over. The youth, they remembered, was a treasured jewel, but one they knew was kept in a distant, locked box. They learned to hold these memories gently, with appreciation, but without the painful longing to reclaim what was gone forever. Some found a private solace in writing. Hidden away from prying eyes, they would fill pages with poetry, personal reflections, fragments of a life lived within walls. This act of writing wasn't for an audience. It was for themselves. It was a way to shape their own narrative, to find a sense of permanence and control in a world where their choices had often been limited. These precious writings were their secrets, sometimes discovered years later, sometimes lost to time forever. Faith remained the central pillar of their lives. Daily rituals and prayers structured their time, providing a comforting predictability in a world of subtle, constant change. But their prayers evolved. They became less about asking for things and more about introspection and acceptance. Faith provided them with a language for patience, for resilience, for cultivating an unshakable inner steadiness. As the years passed, illness and mortality became more visible, more present. Losses occurred quietly, acknowledged through subdued rituals and shared, unspoken understanding. Grief was a private affair, shared sparingly, with support offered through silent presence rather than empty words. Mourning was a dignified, personal process, deeply felt but rarely displayed. The palace itself was in a constant state of flux. Political shifts happening far beyond its walls would send ripples through the internal dynamics, and who sensed these changes first? The older women. Their vast experience allowed them to read the subtle signals that others missed. A slight alteration in a daily routine, a newly revised protocol, a sudden unexplained restriction. They would then prepare the younger generation, not with panicked warnings, but with quiet awareness. Survival, they knew, depended on adaptability. They taught the most important lesson of the palace: nothing is permanent except change itself. With this wisdom, their very concept of freedom began to evolve. The youthful fantasies of escaping the palace walls faded, replaced by something quieter and more profound. Freedom became an internal state. It was the agency you had over your own thoughts, your own responses, your own self-definition. When you couldn't control your circumstances, you learned to master your reaction to them. That was true freedom. Even the wisps of smoke from a shared pipe took on a new meaning. What might have once been a small act of rebellion or a youthful indulgence became a simple, comforting habit. It was a thread of continuity, a quiet ritual that connected the years. It was just another part of the environment. Its meaning softened, reflecting the tranquil wisdom of the women who shared it. The world outside the palace walls became increasingly abstract. The few details that filtered in were like fragments of a dream. Stories of distant lands and bustling cities blurred into vague concepts rather than real destinations. What mattered was not where you could go, but how you chose to live in the place where you remained. Ultimately, their most important role became that of a teacher. But they weren't just teaching court protocol and ceremony. They were teaching the art of endurance. They taught the younger women how to listen without reacting, how to wait without despairing, and how to maintain their self-respect, whether they were in the spotlight or completely overlooked. These weren't lessons you could find in a book. They were transmitted through living example. Watching an older woman navigate a difficult situation with grace and intelligence conveyed more than any instruction ever could. Occasionally, recognition would come, usually unexpectedly. A small gesture of appreciation from someone in power, a cherished privilege that was quietly preserved, a soft-spoken acknowledgement of their long years of service. These moments mattered immensely, not for the reward itself, but because they affirmed decades of unseen, unheard, and uncredited contribution. Yet, even with their profound influence, they remained cautious. They understood that visibility always carried risk. They expertly balanced their authority with a deep sense of humility, ensuring they never appeared as a threat to the established, male-dominated power structures. Time continued its relentless march, thinning the ranks. Faces changed, names faded from memory, but the collective spirit, the lineage of survival, endured. Each woman, in her time, became a vital part of this ongoing story, shaping the palace just as much as it had shaped her. The harem wasn't a static museum. It was a living, breathing organism that adapted and absorbed. Its remarkable stability, its ability to withstand centuries of turmoil, depended on those who had lived within its walls long enough to understand its deepest contradictions. And it was here, in this final, reflective stage of life, where personal ambition had softened and perspective had widened, that these women found their ultimate strength. It wasn't found in what they could gain, but in what they could preserve, their dignity, their memories, and the quiet, unshakable control over their own inner worlds. The palace endured because they endured. As the years piled up, the palace started to feel less like a place of waiting and more like a living archive. Every single corridor held echoes of footsteps from long ago, and every courtyard carried layers of memory. The women who had spent decades inside no longer measured time by grand events, but by the smallest, most subtle shifts, the way the light changed through the lattice windows, the quiet replacement of attendants, the slow transformation of customs that were once considered unbreakable. A strange, deep calm settled into daily life. The urgency that had once defined their youth dissolved into a measured, almost infinite patience. Mornings arrived gently, marked by familiar sounds rather than eager anticipation. The palace felt smaller, not because it had shrunk, but because it had become fully known. Every corner, every shadow, held a story. The women began to see the palace as a system rather than a cage. They had specific times for quiet reflection, favorite corners for solitude, and private routines that offered a quiet sense of ownership over their space. Some women started to cultivate gardens in overlooked courtyards, carefully tending to herbs and flowers that were rarely noticed by others. The simple act of nurturing life, even something as small as a single plant, restored a feeling of continuity, something that existed beyond the constant games of palace politics. Growth, they realized, followed its own logic, completely independent of rank or favor. Even their conversations shifted in tone. Ambition no longer dominated the dialogue. Instead, the women spoke of meaning, of what remains after desire finally fades. Their discussions would wander toward philosophy, poetry, faith, and memory. These exchanges were unhurried, free from the old fear of being overheard or misunderstood. They had found a space for genuine connection. Music continued to drift through the palace, but the performances grew softer, more introspective. Instruments were played, not for approval or applause, but for personal expression. A single melody, repeated quietly in the evening, could carry years of unspoken emotion without a single word of explanation. It was a language only they understood. Their dreams changed as well. They became less vivid, more symbolic. The outside world rarely made an appearance, and when it did, it was usually as an abstract idea, rather than a real destination. As their dreams turned inward, they reflected a sense of reconciliation, rather than a desperate longing for what was beyond the walls. Illusions of escape transformed into a deep acceptance, not resignation, but a hard-won clarity. These women came to recognize the crucial difference between surrender and peace. Peace was something they chose deliberately, something they built for themselves through understanding, not something imposed by circumstance. Friendships deepened, becoming the bedrock of their existence. Bonds that formed later in life were quieter, but far more resilient. These relationships required no performance, no pretense. Silence between companions felt comfortable, even necessary. Just being present for one another became the ultimate reassurance. Occasionally, new arrivals would enter the palace, bringing with them the same confusion and tension that had once defined the earlier generations. The older women watched with a quiet empathy, recognizing their own pasts in the hesitant gestures and guarded expressions of the newcomers. They offered guidance, but only sparingly. Experience had taught them that too much advice could overwhelm rather than help. Instead, they conveyed reassurance through their steady availability, simply being there when questions finally emerged from the confusion. Stories were shared selectively. They learned that certain truths had to be withheld until the listener was truly ready to hear them. Wisdom, they knew, like trust, had to be earned gradually, step by step. The palace's political environment continued to shift, as it always did. New officials would arrive and introduce revised expectations, altering rhythms that had once felt permanent. But the older women adapted quickly, understanding that true resistance lay not in refusal, but in flexibility. They preserved a sense of continuity by absorbing change without allowing it to fracture their sense of identity. Adaptation became a silent art form, practiced daily with grace. Health became an increasing focus. Their care routines were refined, relying on traditional knowledge passed down through generations. Remedies, massages, dietary adjustments, these practices became communal, reinforcing their interdependence. When illness appeared, it was met with calm, focused attention rather than fear. Mortality was no longer a distant, terrifying thought. It was acknowledged respectfully, without drama, as a natural part of life's cycle. Their faith also matured, becoming something quieter and more personal. Prayer turned into a form of reflection rather than a list of requests. Spirituality offered a solid grounding, a sense of inner stability, not easy answers. Even their small indulgences softened. The smoke from incense, once a symbol of escape, became just a familiar presence, less about altering perception, more about simply marking the passage of time. Its meaning had shifted, just as the women themselves had. The palace itself seemed to age alongside its inhabitants. The stones weathered, the colors of the silks softened, the wood of the furniture was polished smooth by countless touches over countless years. But rather than decay, this aging conveyed a sense of endurance, of resilience. At times, nostalgia would surface unexpectedly, a scent, a sound, a fragment of conversation triggering a flood of memories. These moments were met gently, without resistance. The past was no longer painful. It was simply part of the whole tapestry of their lives. Slowly, the women began to understand their legacy, though their names would never appear in official records. Their influence shaped the daily life of the palace, preserved its traditions, and maintained a quiet stability through decades of uncertainty. They were the silent custodians of continuity. Their legacy didn't require recognition. It existed in the smooth functioning of the palace, in the unbroken transmission of knowledge, in the quiet competence of those who would follow in their footsteps. As the years continued to pass, the palace remained a place of containment, but it had also become a place of meaning. A meaning they created not through freedom of movement, but through the mastery of their own presence. In learning how to remain, these women had learned how to endure. In enduring, they had learned how to live fully, even within the tightest constraints. And in this delicate balance between memory and acceptance, between silence and understanding, their hidden escapes had transformed. They no longer led outward, to a world they couldn't reach. They led inward, toward a sense of wholeness that could never be touched by walls or rules. The palace never released them, but in the end, it no longer defined them either. In the later years, the palace settled into a rhythm that felt almost suspended outside of ordinary time. Days no longer rushed forward. They unfolded with a deliberate slowness, as though the very walls had learned patience. For many women within them, this stage brought an unexpected clarity. What once felt uncertain had become familiar, and what once caused fear now inspired a deep understanding. Attention turned inward. Without the constant pull of ambition or rivalry, women began to examine their own thoughts more closely. Reflection became a daily companion, a quiet conversation with the self. Questions once avoided were finally considered: who they had been before the palace, who they had become within it, and what remained unchanged beneath all the layers of adaptation. Some discovered that their identity had not been erased, only reshaped. The skills they developed in confinement, keen observation, emotional intelligence, profound restraint, were now recognized not just as survival tools, but as strengths. These qualities, once necessary to navigate a treacherous world, became sources of quiet, unshakable pride. The very things that had kept them safe now made them wise. The concept of influence also evolved. Rather than guiding outcomes directly through plots or whispers, older women began to influence the atmosphere itself. Their mere presence could calm rising tension. Their measured reactions could set the tone for an entire room. When conflict threatened to emerge, it often dissolved simply because they were there, steady and composed, like anchors in a stormy sea. Younger women instinctively gravitated toward them during moments of uncertainty. Comfort was found not in grand promises, but in simple consistency. Seeing someone who had endured decades of palace life and remained whole offered a powerful reassurance that stability was possible, even here. Teaching continued, but in a more subtle, profound way. Lessons were conveyed through behavior rather than direct instruction. A composed response during a difficult exchange demonstrated resilience more effectively than any piece of advice ever could. A quiet act of kindness spoke volumes about compassion. The palace's rigid hierarchy began to soften at the edges. Formal ranks still existed, of course, but true respect increasingly followed experience rather than title. Longevity itself carried a unique authority. Those who had remained, who had weathered every storm, were trusted implicitly. Memory became a shared space, a communal tapestry woven from countless threads. Women would reminisce together, reconstructing fragments of past events, filling in the gaps left by time. These conversations weren't about dwelling on loss, but about affirming continuity. Remembering together strengthened their bonds, reminding them that they were not just individuals, but part of a long, unbroken story. Occasionally, someone would speak of the outside world, not with a sense of longing, but with a detached curiosity. News arrived distorted and incomplete, a faint echo from a distant reality. Yet it still reminded them that life beyond the walls continued to change. These reminders no longer caused distress or a feeling of being left behind. Instead, they reinforced the value of the present moment, the preciousness of the here and now. Acceptance deepened. It was no longer something practiced deliberately, a choice to be made each day. It had become instinctive, as natural as breathing. This acceptance wasn't an approval of their circumstances, but a complete acknowledgement of reality without resistance. It was the end of the fight against the inevitable. Rituals took on a heightened importance. Simple, everyday actions: preparing tea with mindful precision, folding garments just so, walking familiar paths through the gardens became grounding anchors. These small ceremonies provided structure and reassurance, marking the passage of each day with a sense of purpose and peace. Silence, too, gained a new meaning. It was no longer associated with suppression or fear, but with tranquility. Silence allowed thoughts to settle, and emotions to surface without judgment. It became a sanctuary, a refuge where the soul could rest. The palace itself seemed to respond to this internal shift. Spaces that once felt cold and imposing now felt warmer. The light filtered differently through windows that had been observed for a lifetime. Familiarity had softened every edge, turning a prison into a peculiar kind of home. Even solitude became companionable. Women learned to be alone without ever feeling isolated. Solitude offered restoration, not emptiness. It was a time for recharging, for being with the one person who had been there through it all, oneself. When illness and loss inevitably occurred, they were met with a calm dignity. Grief was acknowledged openly, yet gently. Support flowed naturally, without ceremony or fuss. Loss no longer shocked. It reminded them of the fragility and preciousness of life. Faith, now deeply personal, offered quiet comfort. Spiritual practice became more reflective than formal. Prayer was less about asking for things and more about expressing gratitude for the simple fact of endurance. Time itself began to blur, folding the past and present into a continuous sense of now. This temporal softness reduced regret. There was less comparison, less longing for what might have been. There was only what is. Some women began to prepare for their final departure from life itself. This preparation was unspoken, but universally understood. Affairs were settled quietly, and small possessions were distributed thoughtfully to those who would remain. These acts were not morbid. They were practical and caring, a final gesture of order and love. Legacy occupied their thoughts. Not a legacy written in official records or carved in stone, but the living legacy of their influence. They considered how their presence had shaped others, how their quiet guidance had helped preserve balance and sanity within these walls. This awareness brought a deep, quiet satisfaction. Younger women, sensing these final transitions, offered their respect through simple attention. Small gestures, listening carefully to a story, maintaining a cherished tradition honored those who had carried the palace through so many years of change. The hidden escapes of their earlier lives, secret hobby, a forbidden friendship, had transformed entirely. What once provided momentary relief now held little significance. Escape was no longer necessary. The internal world they had cultivated provided more than enough space. Wisdom emerged, not as a set of certainties, but as a profound tolerance for ambiguity. They accepted that not all questions required answers, and that some mysteries were meant to remain. Understanding this brought a final, liberating peace. The palace continued its function, a grand machine largely unaware of the incredible inner journeys unfolding within its heart. Yet its stability, its very soul, depended on these unseen transformations. In this final stage, these women no longer measured their lives by what had been denied, but by what had been endured with grace. Endurance itself became their meaning. And so, as time continued to move forward beyond their control, they remained present anchored, composed, and whole. They carried within them a freedom that no structure could ever restrict. What they had learned, what they had become, could not be taken away, not by walls, not by silence, and not by time. In the twilight years of the palace, life was not a slow fade into absence, but a quiet accumulation of perspective. For the women who had spent decades navigating its intricate protocols, the walls that once felt like a cage had become a familiar landscape. They moved with an ease born from understanding, no longer consumed by ambition, but essential to the very heartbeat of the institution. To the outside world, they were all but invisible. Inside, they were everything. Time had a way of softening the sharp edges of protocol. What once demanded constant performance, the practiced courtesies, the strategic appearances, the delicate dance for favor had mellowed into a fluid, almost effortless competence. Their movements became deliberate, measured, confident. A single glance could now soothe a rising tension. A quiet word could anchor uncertainty. Years of experience had transformed their influence from a sharp tool into a subtle, pervasive force. The palace itself seemed to bend to their will, adapting to their deep understanding of its inner workings. While their bodies were confined, their minds were boundless. This internal world became their truest domain of freedom. No wall could contain a thought, no rule could chain the imagination. Within the palace, these women held entire universes, memories of shifting alliances, knowledge of unspoken rules, and a profound, quiet observation of human nature. These inner sanctuaries were where their identities remained whole, where they could reflect, and dream, and move in ways impossible beyond the gates. Younger women, finally free from the pressure to perform, listened with a mix of awe. Memory became their most powerful tool. Events were recounted not for drama, but to understand the cycles of life within the walls, the patterns of favor and fortune, the lessons learned from a misjudged word or a poorly timed ambition. Each story was a testament to survival, a masterclass in navigating circumstance. This accumulation of experience forged an internal authority far greater than any title or rank could bestow. Daily life found its rhythm in ritual. Breakfasts, readings, music, prayer. Every routine was layered with meaning. Mundane acts became deliberate choices, small assertions of identity and control in a world that still demanded so much. The careful arrangement of a tea tray, the precise placement of a cushion, the timing of a glance, these were the silent communications of women who understood power in its most subtle forms, conveying authority without ever needing to raise their voice. As mortality drew near, contemplation deepened. They considered their legacy, not in wealth or fame, but in the influence they had wielded and the resilience they had cultivated. They had weathered the hidden storms of the harem, navigated the treacherous currents of favor, and maintained their composure when all control seemed lost. Relationships were acknowledged with a gentle finality. Unspoken thanks were finally given. Prayer became a quiet reflection, a way to reconcile a life of endurance with the impermanence of all things. The same echoes filled the corridors. The same footfalls marked the passage of time, but for these women, a fundamental shift had occurred. They had moved from mere survival to true mastery, from endurance to understanding, from isolation to an unassailable internal freedom. Even the smallest indulgences took on a new significance, a moment of stolen silence, a private reading, the gentle curl of smoke from a favored pipe. The sovereignty they had achieved was one of self-control, of perception, of response. The corridors felt familiar, almost protective. The light falling through the windows created patterns they had come to know and appreciate. The air, once heavy with scrutiny, now felt like a comforting embrace. The harem had transformed from a prison into a world they knew completely. Their legacy was not written in stone, but woven into the very fabric of the palace. It lived in the routines they established, the lessons they passed down, and the collective memory of the institution itself. And so, as the palace continued its endless cycles, these women existed with a freedom that no walls could ever take away. Their lives were proof that survival, patience, and understanding could forge a power where it was least expected. The Sultan's palace did not confine them, it refined them. It was a crucible that tested their endurance and rewarded their subtlety. And while the world outside churned with unpredictable change, they remained a steady, quiet force, having transformed the constraints around them into the very architecture of their survival. Within those walls, they discovered that even in the most restrictive of circumstances, the seeds of freedom can grow if one learns to wield time, thought, and influence with quiet wisdom. They were not just subjects of history. They were living proof that a life can be both constrained and profoundly, unshakably whole. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe for more journeys into the hidden corners of history.